Just for those of us who may be new, returning after some time, or for others who may be viewing the meeting, I just wanted to convene the meeting and then follow it with a quick round of introductions, excuse me. I'll start by introducing myself, and then I'll call out your first names, and then if you would just take a moment to introduce yourself, sharing your full name and the institution that you are here to represent or organization. We are convening the meeting. For my introduction, my name is Bridget Kessner, and I am the chair of this committee, and I am representing the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence. Kristen?
Hello all, my name is Kristen Eshwe, and I am from Sacred Heart University.
Thank you. Hillary?
Hi, I'm Hillary Haldane, and I'm at Quinnipiac University.
Thank you. Lilly?
Hey everyone, I'm Lilly Svensson, and I'm at Yale University.
Great, thanks. Kara?
Hi everyone, I'm Kara Mackler. I am at the Center for Empowerment Education at Western Connecticut State University at our Salt Lake office.
Thank you. Lisa?
Sorry about that. I'm Lisa Giliberto. I'm with the Victim Rights Center, a division of the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence.
Thanks. Amber?
Hey, I'm Amber Stevenson, and I'm representing Every Voice Connecticut.
Colleen?
Hi, everyone. I'm Colleen Carney, representing the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities.
Letisa?
Hi, Letisa Reed, Associate Vice President of Institutional Equity and Title IX Coordinator for UConn.
Thank you. Representative Elliott?
Hey, Rep. Elliott, representing the 88th District. I am the chair of the Higher Education and Employment Advancement Committee.
Great to see you. Thanks. Jeannie?
Good morning. I'm Jeannie Phillips, and I staff the council, and I'm also clerk of higher ed at Rep. Elliott's aide.
Thank you very much. And Austin?
Hi, I'm Austin Hyatt. I'm Jeannie's assistant.
Welcome. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. We have a pretty packed agenda today, so I'm eager to get started. So just to provide a brief overview, we're going to be talking through some provisions within the VAWA reauthorization that it really looks like could have a substantial impact on the work that we're doing as a council. So we're going to talk about the way that that intersects, and then what our duties may look like moving forward as a result of that intersect. Additionally, I want to talk through the last of the tasks that we have to complete as a council. As I had shared in my email, I did have a couple of requests for a bit of extra time to complete some of the review of the content that was in the drive and to contribute some feedback. So we are now at a point where I think we can begin to move forward, and folks have had a period of time to provide feedback about the different tools and implementation and things of that nature. So I want to talk about what we need in order to have a final draft that can be published and distributed, as well as what our distribution plan will look like. So that's sort of what we're going to be talking through today. I did just want to start with the VAWA reauthorization. You might have seen my email that went out last week with a link to talk through section 1507, which is speaks to an online survey tool that is going to be developed and made available by the Secretary of Education and a host of other folks within the federal government. There are more survey questions that are, than are prescribed by our legislation, as well as it is explicitly named as a survey that would be distributed rather than the more broad term assessment we've been utilizing as a council and through our legislation. Institutions will be able to add additional questions subject to the review and approval by the Secretary of Education. Responses are going to be confidential and not included in crime statistics. The survey that is distributed is supposed to be trauma informed. The language in this legislation speaks to the accessibility of the tool, ensuring that individuals will all have an ability who are, at these institutions of higher education to participate. It does prescribe that they are completed every 2 years. However, there really isn't a timeline as to when we would anticipate this would begin. And then the report that would come from the surveys would need to be published, including the campus level data on the institution's website, as well as available to the Secretary of Education for further use, as well as a more broad and collective overview of some of this data. So, of course, this definitely impacts what we're doing here in Connecticut, given that, especially that it is more prescriptive than our, than our tasks as a council. Again, given that we're unsure of the timeline, I'm eager to hear some feedback from folks, but I think at this point, we do know institutions have a need to fulfill the legislation here in Connecticut by implementing a tool by spring of next year. We're unsure of exactly what this is going to look like in terms of timeline. So I think we're in a position where we do need to move forward as a council with what we are tasked with, given the timeline that we are provided in our legislation. However, I think that it is critical that we do keep into consideration how we might be receiving some feedback from institutions and what our tasks are going to look like in the future and moving forward as a result of the federal legislation here. I did create a bit of a chart to kind of talk through what our particular tasks are under the state legislation, as well as how the federal legislation may impact those tasks. So I'm going to share my screen and review that. All right, so folks can see my screen here. All right. So as you can see, within the state legislation, we do need to have some data points we need to collect regarding student awareness of institutional policies and procedures related to sexual assault, stalking, and intimate partner violence. The federal legislation further extends this. The language is very similar, as you'd see. However, they also will be collecting information on sexual harassment, which is not as explicitly defined in our state legislation. The second piece is that students would be asked if they reported the instances defined here to the institution of higher education, and then the response and results of those reports. There is, as you'll see in these lines describing the federal legislation, there are a lot of different questions that would be asked, again, more prescriptive than what we are asking here in Connecticut. They're both asking whether or not it was reported, and then the response to and results of such report is further extended within the federal legislation, including whom it was reported to, whether or not they were referred to resources, if an investigation occurred, as well as some information about the investigation, including what the resolution looked like. Additionally, we have to find data points to speak to student perceptions of campus safety. This was not included in the federal legislation, so this is something that I think we still have more flexibility on. As I had stated, within the federal legislation, there are additional questions that are allowed to be added by these campuses through, provided they have approval from the Secretary of Education. So this is something we're, of course, going to need to keep in mind, given that we have the ability to provide that data point, and we want to ensure institutions understand that they'll still have this duty through the state, in addition to the federal legislation. We also have the duty of recommending one or more sexual misconduct climate assessments. According to the federal legislation, there's going to be one uniform survey that's distributed nationwide to students. So, of course, this is very different in terms of what our duty would look like, in that we have essentially planned to provide sort of a list of surveys that we found would be suitable and provided some ability for choice at these institutions. However, there would be sort of one tool in place. So this would limit our ability to recommend other tools, but we can recommend the federal tool, of course, as well as additional questions to measure perceptions of campus safety, whether we would want to find a particular tool that spoke to that the best or provide tools that speak to that, so that question could be included by institutions. We also have the duty to recommend guidelines for implementation, and this is still a place where we have a great deal of flexibility, right? So while this mechanism is going to be provided and administered by the federal government, there would be some flexibility we would have to provide information about achieving a high rate of response, how to protect confidentiality, receiving responses from a broad group, as well as how to be trauma informed through this process, right? Because that kind of ties into achieving a high response rate, protecting confidentiality, and ensuring that diverse groups are protected. So there is still some flexibility we have here, and I think a lot of our work that we've done thus far, we would continue to do in the same manner moving forward, no matter what were to happen with this federal legislation. And then, of course, we have, the ability to perform such other acts that may be necessary and appropriate to carry out the duties described in this section. So again, there would be some flexibility as to what that would look like. So at the moment, that is sort of the review that I had completed. And I did want to open it up for any questions, comments, considerations, based on the information we just kind of reviewed and your own review of the federal legislation in comparison to our own. Any thoughts? Lily, yeah?
I was wondering, this is a question for Representative Elliott and Haynes, whether there has been discussion among legislators about the relationship between the Connecticut and new federal guidelines.
None as far as I know. We are basically waiting for you to tell us what we need to do. As far as I know, Irene, tell me if that's wrong.
Yeah, I was shaking my head. No, I haven't heard anything yet. So no, we're waiting. We're waiting on that. So could you share your screen again, Bridget, in regards to the questions, just so we can, as we discuss, we can take a look at that.
Absolutely. This is also a document I can follow up with the group later with, so you have the links on hand. Lily?
I have a follow-up question, if that's okay. Representative Elliott, you mentioned sort of waiting for this group's feedback or guidance. And as someone who's not as familiar with sort of what the options might be, do you have a sense of sort of what actions we might guide the Connecticut legislature to take in this case?
Basically, we wait until you tell us what you need us to do. Just chronologically, session-wise, we are about at the end when we can take on any new ideas for this year. So anything that we're talking about won't really be implementable until next year, unless we really feel that it will be completely bipartisan with no pushback from anybody anywhere, and we can sort of plunk it into some omnibus bill. But otherwise, we take direction for the most part, at least my perspective, from the experts, and I can consider everybody on this call to be the expert. So it's, again, whatever you end up telling us to do is what we'll end up doing.
Thank you. That's helpful. Did you have any follow-up, Lily?
No, I'm trying to kind of square the circle with these two pieces of legislation. So a tricky one. I'm very interested to hear what other folks' responses have been to the federal legislation.
Yeah, I also would be eager to hear any feedback about our plan moving forward, just given again that we don't necessarily have a timeline on what this looks like. And I want to ensure that we're keeping to the requirements of this legislation, as well as that the institutions have the ability to follow what we provide them with. So Kristen, I see your hand up.
One thought I had while you were talking was and I don't know if this is at all feasible, even if it was just for our state, if we had a list of questions not part of the federal that we were wanting our state to kind of look into, if we could kind of get them pre-approved so that each school doesn't have to do it, and we could maybe just somehow give them a list of, these have been already approved by the Secretary of Education, you're good to add them. That was one thought I had to kind of maybe help bridge any gaps, make things easier.
Yeah, and I think we can definitely also review some of what we were really hoping to get to and ask as a council based on the documents that we have sort of completed already, and see where there's that overlap. If you go and look through the federal legislation, there is a significant number of questions that they're really seeking to ask, and it's rather in depth, especially speaking to, for those individuals that may have reported what their experience was. So I'm definitely hopeful we can find a way, though, to get in the questions that are more so speaking to the perception of campus safety in a more streamlined process. Hillary?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I looked over with the legislation, and they're really comprehensive questions. I mean, they read very closely to what, for instance, like ARC 3 asks, which is one of the ones that we've reviewed. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see elements of those questions, which again, very detailed, very in depth. And so what I was wondering in terms of the timeline, it seems to me that looking at how comprehensive the federal legislation is, the implementation part is still something that I think we as a council can give guidance to. I mean, in terms of universities and colleges are really going to have a whole of institution approach, given the level and types of questions that we see in the federal legislation. And so what I'm wondering is, I feel like that's where we as a council can still be very useful in terms of delivering. And to Kristen's point about if there are those questions that we at the state level would like to ask the Secretary of Education to include for our surveys on the federal mandated survey.
Sure.
But I'm also wondering then, given the kinds of questions that it does look like the federal legislation will include in their one national survey, some of the ones that we went through and reviewed, if we're going to have our institutions, if the institutions are going to have to deliver a survey or some other instrument as we're waiting for the federal one, because we have that March deadline of 2023, maybe we should be pointing them then to the ones that are much more comprehensive, because those are the things that as an institution, they should be prepared to have asked and respond to. That was my thinking in reading this, but then I noticed that Representative Hayes had her hand up, so maybe she had something to respond to in terms of the legislation.
Yeah, did you have any input, Representative Hayes? Yeah, I think part of my kind of concern over this is if this were to be something that were implemented, say, next year or the year after that, then what does that look like in terms of response? If campuses, I definitely think that Hillary, that's definitely an important point, is I think if they're preparing to essentially put out something rather comprehensive and then have this requirement to implement a similar, maybe more prescriptive, survey tool in, March of 2023, then I think that could definitely marry rather nicely. I think one of the concerns that I had when I was reviewing all of this is if this is to be implemented for 2024, then what does it look like if they utilized a rather, comprehensive tool, gathered all of this feedback, and then are essentially required by the federal government to repeat the process the next year, and what that would do to really tank survey responses, right? So yes, Lilly.
Yeah, I think related to that, I'm worried about a burden on students.
Mhm.
So, I think we've talked about burden on students in this council, and we've certainly talked a lot about burden on campuses, which I think is, both of those topics are appropriate. I think as we're looking ahead, kind of Bridget, to following along to what you just said, we're looking ahead to an unknown timeline in the next 3 years when the same students might be asked to answer very in-depth, lengthy surveys on a sort of tight turnaround, first to meet a Connecticut legislative need, and then to meet the federal one with different questions that are not exactly comparable. So it's not as though you're sort of building an immediate trend line with any certainty for campuses. So the sort of benefit doesn't seem like it'll shake out. And so I'm a little bit worried about the sequencing of implementation at the state and federal level. That unfortunately, it seems like kind of having all of our ducks in a row sooner at the state level might end up making life harder for students, especially students who've been personally impacted by sexual assault, and for whom these surveys are the most difficult to answer.
Absolutely. And yeah, I definitely have concern for that wellness. And then second to that, the accuracy of responses we would get on that second round. Representative Haynes?
Sorry, guys. Oop, I had to take a call real quick.
No worries.
So I'm back. I just had a quick question. Have you guys looked at the survey? I kind of remember when we were going through the legislation process that Yale has done a substantial survey in regards to this, and that when we were talking about what we would put together, what you guys would put together for the survey, it was something along the same lines that they had done, but to a lesser extent, because that way those who were doing the surveys already in some fashion were compliant with what you guys were putting across as that. So I'm just wondering if there's kind of been a side-by-side comparison of all these different surveys that are done, that we can kind of just, draw a line through and say, okay, this question is being asked, this one's being asked. And so we can, I think it can maybe make the process simpler and make all the schools that are already doing this compliant with what you guys are putting through. So you're not reinventing any wheels at this point, that this is really, where this is all going. Or maybe that's what you already have in your survey there, and I'm late to the game, so.
Yeah, I think the process you described is actually very similar to what we've kind of put together in terms of looking at the different tools, including, as you had mentioned, the Yale had completed the AAU survey in the last 2 rounds, which was one of the more comprehensive surveys that's out there and seen as, definitely, one of the more best practice, comprehensive surveys in a lot of spaces. So we did complete a chart similar to that, but Hillary, I see your hand up, and you can definitely speak to this process more eloquently than I can, I'm sure.
No, you're on the perfect, Bridget, perfect response. The question though is that if the federal government, this is my concern, is the federal government is going to have their survey. That's what the legislation says, is that they're going to have a survey. And so I think, to Lily's point, that's why I'm concerned about us again, we have a few in there, like the ARC3 and the AAU are much more comprehensive surveys. And those, when you look at VAWA's reauthorization, it's very clear they're going to ask those, what we consider maybe on the council, really intrusive questions. They want to gather those data. And so I don't think I mean, my concern is, I mean, just to echo Lily's point, is by looking at the surveys that are already out there, in some ways that doesn't do us any good until we actually see what the new federal survey is going to be. I mean, I won't be surprised if we see things from like ARC3 and AAU in it. Those are the kinds of questions that are going to be included. But that's where I have a concern is we already know what types and domains of questions are going to be asked. That we do know from the legislation. We don't know what the survey instrument is going to look like. So when I'm talking about implementation, I'm talking about really creating that awareness within our college campuses here in Connecticut, that those are the kinds of questions that they are going to be asked. We don't know the timeline, but that's what I'm saying is precisely to not put this burden on students, and especially on survivor students who then feel overwhelmed with this information. What are we doing to help our college campuses here in Connecticut as we prepare for these questions that we know are going to be really quite awful for some of our students? And I think that's what I'm talking about implementation, is knowing those domains. What can we do to be proactive for our state? And then do we have to do, like, what do we have to do in the meantime? I guess that's my question and my concern. So
absolutely. Yeah, I think the implementation piece is definitely the space we have the most flexibility in, no matter what happens. And I think a space that's going to be critically important depending on what's next. Lilly?
Yeah, it's following up from what Hillary just said. I'm thinking back over our previous discussions and the strategies that we've discussed about sort of what this council could produce that would be most useful across the state. And our kind of original strategy was to say, look, we can be most useful by helping campuses look across the board at instruments and implementation guidelines that already exist, and just kind of summarizing them and just saying, here's a bunch of material that's you can get off the shelf. But mostly just kind of pointing people to existing instruments. So the sort of synthesis from our group would end up more pointing campuses toward probably some more comprehensive instruments. Like we were going through and folks who were reviewing existing instruments were really not stopping at the pieces that were prescribed by the Connecticut legislation. We were sort of going much further than that and saying, and there's other material you really should be asking. And here's how these instruments cover those other topics, if you're interested in looking into those. And we sort of went lighter on synthesizing implementation guidelines and more sort of gathered those materials together. And we're talking more about like a document repository. I wonder if an alternative strategy in light of the new federal regs would be to take our same kind of cross-instrument summary and really kind of downplay to a certain extent the places where we've seen more kind of cross-instrument coverage of those extended topics that get into more comprehensive experiences and behaviors, and really just focus on the few kind of rows of our summary that are about meeting the Connecticut legislative need, and saying if you're looking for an off-the-shelf instrument that has questions that cover exactly what's prescribed, like these ones will do it for you. And we could even maybe give guidance or sort of a placeholder to say that we don't know what the federally mandated survey will look like. And in that absence, to avoid overburdening students, we recognize that campuses are going to have some hard choices to make about when to ask in-depth surveys and of whom. And then, we could maybe, this group's focus could then turn, to Hillary's point, more to implementation guidelines and kind of creating something more cohesive, that's oriented toward Connecticut colleges and universities about how, maybe even how to run something in the next year, as opposed to the federal thing that's coming down the pipeline. But it feels like kind of our strategy needs to shift a little bit as to what we're providing.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Lily. I definitely agree with sort of moving in that direction, seeing where we can provide more information within the implementation piece. I think, based on the feedback that I'm getting today and my own understanding, I think, and definitely feel free for anyone to jump in and provide more feedback, but our best direction may be to essentially have these institutions prepare to do something more comprehensive, because there's going to require a certain level of skill set and resources, et cetera. If they need to fall back on something a bit less comprehensive, because we come to find that based on the timeline of the federal legislation, it would, interfere. One would interfere with the other, then perhaps, they could still apply that skill set to the following year, fall back on something less comprehensive that still fits the state legislation, and then further, do something more comprehensive, that will need to be completed, of course, with that federal survey. Allie, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just have a question. I came a bit late. I read through the federal legislation, but I was wondering if we know, like, this is just proposed legislation, right, at this point? Or has it been passed? Like, what's the level of certainty about its implementation across the country in the coming years? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that to the extent I understand it, which is that, this is associated with the reauthorization of VAWA. And it seems that this is not necessarily one of the more contentious sort of pieces of that. So there isn't necessarily, it does seem that it would be more likely than not to be implemented with the VAWA reauthorization. But that's my understanding and what I've heard thus far in terms of doing a bit of digging and seeking out some other, national partners and resources. So that's my understanding, if anyone else wants to jump in. But yes, you are correct in that it has not yet been, signed into law. But given the substantial impact, I think, regardless of that, I think this is a necessary conversation to have, because it's something that, again, it isn't something that is necessarily going to be as contentious of a piece, and likely is going to see bipartisan support and moving forward. And then I think, regardless, clearly this is something that's on the federal government's radar, and it's something we could see in another sort of format moving forward, and I think is worth the conversation regardless of the status. But there is a reasonable likelihood that this is something we could actually see the impact of in the next in the coming months and years. Hillary?
Well, I just had a question on that, because my read of the reauthorization was that this was included and that was signed by Biden. So that's why that's why I had the question, is that I thought that the entire thing got reauthorized with this provision included, because that's already why all the different tribal entities can change their practice. Or is that we're waiting for something else beyond that? I just wanted a clarification question, because I thought with that Biden signature was about the reauthorization of the whole thing, which was inclusive of this. So and the sponsor of it, Jackie Sphere, I think, was the rep who was the sponsor. She was celebrating that it got included. So that's why I'm just.
Okay. Yeah. Let me look into that further.
Clarification. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Let me look into that and provide further clarity. Because again, this has just been from some conversations with national partners and digging around on the, the landing page for the legislation. Yeah. All right. Well, I think, Lily?
I'm wondering, given the very high likelihood that the federal regs are as they are, and they're with us. Like maybe there's some amount of like correction that could theoretically happen to the language. I would hope that there would be. There are some things that are, I think, highly problematic the way this section is written. But it seems like campuses have a really lengthy single survey coming toward them in the next however long. Does it make sense for our council to advise that campuses needn't run something in the next year until we know like what else they're going to need to run? Is that even feasible? I know some campuses will have their own survey plans, and they have a cadence, and they'll sort of carry out those plans regardless. And that's fine, but especially as we're talking about sort of how the Connecticut and federal legislation fit together, like, is one of the tools that we have to say, you know, would federal override state on this one? And because of that, should we hit pause on a state survey data collection mandate until there's more clarity on the timeline, at least at the federal level?
Yeah, and I can definitely appreciate that concern because of the conflict that it could present. But I think given, Section 3 of the legislation does say, that it provides a date, which is March 1st of 2023, that institutions do need to conduct an assessment by. That includes the data points that our council provides and otherwise pursuant to Section 2 of the Act. So I think, unfortunately, that does limit our flexibility. But I think we are going to have to obviously keep in mind that this is going to, look different depending on when the federal legislation comes down. Colleen?
Do you think that's something that our representatives would consider, changing? I know Representative Elliott said, and this might be controversial, so I don't know if he would get 100% support on both sides, but there is a possibility to change something given the federal, that this came after all of this work has been done, but it's really going to flip everything a little bit. And for those of us who are starting from zero, kind of, who are trying to build, like Lily said, there's some institutions that this won't impact as much because they're already implementing those really comprehensive surveys. But for those of us who are looking to build our path, this is going to, it's going to be difficult to put something out in 23 and then put out something different in 24, because, we were ready for the Connecticut, we were ready for that. But I guess there's just so much change within the questions and how comprehensive they are. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. I don't think that, I think it could potentially be controversial. So I don't know how much support Representative Elliott would get for that to wait a year, like say, put it out in March 24 and see where we are with this. We don't know how long the feds are going to take to put something out. But just my thoughts.
I would need help with the advocacy. I mean, nothing's impossible. We're just late in the session is all. So I'm happy to talk with Bridget offline
Okay,
see how the Alliance can help with this.
Sure.
I just don't want to overpromise anything. That's all.
absolutely.
Yeah, definitely appreciate that. And
Yeah.
Representative Elliott, I'd be glad to meet ASAP so we can sort of figure that out. And I think if anybody wants to weigh in with similar concerns, yet similar or in the other direction, if you have those as well, because I'd want to make sure that we're sort of moving forward in a way that includes everyone's perspective. But I have concerns about this conflict as well in terms of what this would look like and how it would impact, I think, student survivors who we want to ensure feel, protected and have a source of empowerment through this process, rather than feeling re-traumatized by potentially 2 years in a row having to answer comprehensive questions about their victimization. Colleen?
Sorry, just one last thing. I just wanted to mention that, say some sort of proposal like that was to move forward. I don't think that obviously our group could continue and we could continue to talk about all of this and really get our arms around, what we need to do. And so our work can continue, though. I wouldn't want to pause any of the momentum that we've created with this group, because I think this group has done a lot of great work, and it's important. We're already established, we're here, we can keep working on this. So just want to throw that out there.
No, I really appreciate that, Colleen, because I think similarly, as Lilly had said, we're potentially leaning in what direction our work is going to really substantially take in providing more implementation guidelines, given that's where flexibility may be. I think it would be helpful for us to continue to meet, and rather than focusing on individual tools on how they kind of ask about these particular data points, considering all but one of those data points are going to be included in a federal survey, I think having more discussion about implementation and best practice in implementation, seeing what support institutions may need in order to implement, and then providing that within our guidance, I think is going to be, a critical conversation and one we can continue to have. So I think that it would be important for us to continue to meet and figure out what that will look like, as well as how we can best do our work and, under whatever comes down from the federal government. Hillary, I see your hand up.
Oh, yeah. I just affirm everything you just said. I agree with that. And also I am concerned with the lag, only because, just working in an institution, I don't want them to think that, oh, okay, now we can kind of put this off. That is my concern. It means that survivors are going to be falling through the cracks in the meantime. So that's, to my mind, how do we keep this a conversation with our university and college partners to ensure that they really are continuing to, and even being more focused on this, given what may be required of them. And then what are we doing for people in the meantime? That is my concern, is we've still got survivors and we've still got things happening. And so how then do we as a state, are we caring for all those students as we're kind of in this limbo? That's all. Those are just some of the concerns so I agree with Colleen's point about, can this council keep going, and what are the kinds of things that we can do, really preventative efforts, culture change type efforts as we're waiting for the feds.
Yeah, no, Hillary, that was on my mind as well. And it's critically important. And I think, I think the Alliance can definitely be a part of that conversation, and I can definitely bring that perspective to the table in terms of what our resources look like to ensure information is out there. I think one of the benefits we, kind of imagine to this is that it's a way to start conversation about, the issue of sexual violence. It's a way to ensure students have one more, resource, right? One more place where they have this provision of resources listed out. They know where to go in certain instances, depending on what they want. So I think ensuring that we can still, sort of access some of those more important pieces and provide those to campuses, but while also ensuring that we're keeping survivors in mind either way, right? Because we also, the potential for a delay would also prevent re-traumatization of survivors and be a trauma-informed move. But we would want to ensure we're being trauma-informed in what we're doing in the interim. Allie?
Yeah, I really appreciate this point, and I'm trying to, I see the contention that I think everyone's trying to mediate here, which is tough. What I'm reminded of is that we have so many institutions in Connecticut that have not ever collected this data or haven't in like years and years and years. I'm wondering, and I don't know how this would work, it could be a slippery slope, but our legislation as is right now has a distinction between assessment and survey, one of which is significantly more thorough. I wonder if there's room for a compromise sort of in what we suggest maybe universities and colleges lead with in anticipation of that federal legislation. I don't know, but I'm trying to think if there's some sort of in between so that colleges and universities, like Hillary said, aren't neglecting those super seriously needed insights while we wait, which could be uncertain.
Yeah. Lilly and Hillary, given your expertise, I'd be glad to hear you weigh in if you have any thoughts.
Well, I mean, I would just say, I mean, this is where, again, I'm kind of, in between, because some of the survey instruments that we've looked at that are in our shared folder, I mean, I can already see that those are going to be questions that, given what was written in the reauthorization, those are the questions of those domains, and especially because the AAU and the ARC3 are both representative by people who've been involved with these various task forces at both the White House and Department of Education. There are people who've been informing that. So to my mind, there's already ones that we've looked at that are definitely going to be the time. I mean, this one includes even things like behavioral and perception. So those are going to be getting at potential people who may be perpetrating these actions. There's a whole set of questions that are already on there that are on kind of perception of, things like consent and whatnot. So where I'm sitting in between is that my concern is not that we don't have examples of instruments, and I'd be curious to hear what everyone else thinks, that probably are going to cover the range of questions that will be asked on a federal instrument. I'm pretty positive of that. My concern is just going to be the time frame in which, again, if we've got universities who do this really comprehensive survey, something like the ARC3, you need to bring that whole of institution approach. You really need to be on high alert for care and concerns. And then they have to do it again if all of a sudden the federal instrument drops either fall of 2023, spring of 2024. So those are my concerns. So that's where I'm a little bit stuck in terms of, from one mindset, I could see preparing institutions based on the surveys we have for the types of things that our students are going to have to answer and that we want to be prepared for. Asking those questions within the next 9 months to a year later, I find is very survivor unfriendly. That's my concern. So that's where I'm stuck between the two poles. But I agree with Ali 100%. We have institutions that haven't even started the process of doing these types of instrument use, and that is a concern too. So that was a very unhelpful answer. Sorry.
No, definitely helpful. Lilly?
Yeah, I'm reflecting on a couple of things. One is that there are many, many forms of assessment. I think if we kind of like open that all the way back up, that breadth of options itself becomes really difficult for campuses to then kind of wade through. I'm looking back at the narrower sort of set of prescribed topics for assessments to include per the Connecticut legislation. And I wonder if there's some, and this is totally just an idea, like to kind of keep our brainstorm going, but like is one idea for our council to recommend that over the next year, kind of by that March 1 of 23 deadline, that campuses might choose whether to run a new or ongoing assessment that would gather these data, Or they could opt to wait on the federal survey that's coming out, and like, could campuses do something in lieu of running a new assessment, but that would be geared toward actually improving the metrics that are written into the Connecticut legislation? Like, I think that a strength of the approach that we have at the state level here is that we've been so oriented toward actually supporting students and supporting campuses in their pursuit of better education and prevention. I don't see those same that same focus in the federal legislation. It just kind of, it doesn't come through the way that legislation is written. So, I mean, maybe one way to kind of, as Allison said, mediate between these two needs and figure out how do we prepare campuses for more, for an in-depth assessment that's kind of coming toward them on an uncertain timeline in the next couple of years, without overburdening survivors and other sensitive populations, but do keep these topics and prevention and education in mind. Like, can we lean more into the reason we gather these data, which is to improve student awareness of institutional policies and procedures? Like, what are campuses doing to try to improve their student awareness of policies and procedures? Like, could our council advise, like, in the meantime, as we wait for federal regs to kind of be worked out, report back on the timeline given in the Connecticut legislation on what you're doing, assuming we all have room to improve. What is happening on your campus to help improve the experience of students who make a report of an experience to, you know, campus authorities, or to improve student perceptions of campus safety? These are the things that are written into the Connecticut enabling legislation for this group, because we think, presumably, we agree that it matters for these things to be at top of mind and to improve over time.
Mm-hmm.
Does that start to get to some feasible kind of near-term solution for kind of how to keep these topics in mind, but not overburden students? Because you wouldn't necessarily be mandating kind of a rapid succession of data collection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I suppose that may matter, or that may depend on whether or not we are able to change that deadline or not.
Yeah.
May depend on what that looks like. I think on one hand, it could look like sort of revisiting some of these, you know, some of the prevention and intervention efforts that are taking place and providing support in that capacity. And then I think on another hand, if we are unable to change the date, I think it may be, okay, how can an assessment that fits, you know, these boxes that we kind of have based on the legislation, how can we ensure we have some sort of assessment in place, but that it is looks different than some sort of one of these very comprehensive surveys, that it's something that could be, you know, could be completed in a way that is more trauma informed than and more effective than having kind of back-to-back comprehensive surveys, right? How could it look? What would a more small scale, you know, assessment look like? And that we already sort of talked about that when we talked about the enabling, you know, legislation in the first place, is what would it look like if every other year institutions did something less comprehensive and sort of had another form of assessment that they turned to. So I think it is important that we start to consider both what it would look like if we have sort of this new interim period, how we continue to provide support, potentially evaluate programming and efforts and things of that nature, which would also be, given the information that campuses currently provide, something that we have a lot of information available to us about. And then additionally, what will this look like if we are unable to extend that time frame, and what sort of assessments may we want to consider putting in place that would be much less prescriptive than what we anticipate will be coming down from the federal government, but continuing to also provide in either case these implementation guidelines, so that institutions are prepared as they are going into at some point this larger federal tool. So I think to an extent, from my perspective, I think it may depend on what our next steps look like and what changes we are or aren't able to achieve, based on this new information. But does anybody else have any input or thoughts on this particular? I appreciate all the creativity and thought and concerns everyone's bringing to the table, given that this was definitely, again, significantly impacts kind of what we're doing here in Connecticut. I'm thankful that we're still centering the, the concern of campus safety and the voices of survivors, and finding ways that we can continue to move forward with, their wellness in mind. So with that, I will stop sharing this, but I would like to talk about what I always, as I'm sure you have all noticed by now, I like to talk about what our concrete steps look like moving forward. So with that in mind, I can definitely, as Representative Elliott had said, I'm definitely happy to meet and discuss what our options may look like, and we can sort of move forward with a more comprehensive plan from there, depending on what happens at the end of the session here. But I think I do want to focus on sort of beefing up some of our implementation guidelines and ensuring that those are keeping in mind the concerns, that institutions may have approaching a new, very comprehensive tool, and sort of pivot some of our focus to that source. I also would like to, I will sort of amend the draft of a report that I have that would still preface all of this to ensure that it addresses, this specific federal piece and how that has impacted our work. I think I can even include, that chart if anybody would like to provide any further input on it, but sort of showing that comparison. So where do we still have some flexibility, and where are we sort of just at, directed by the federal government, and our institutions more so are directed by the federal government. So I definitely plan to amend that report that would accompany what we put out. I think we can put out some of that implementation guidance, and maybe just for those of you who perhaps were not involved in that aspect of the project, if you have some time that you could contribute in the next week or two to that document within the drive. I think what we had kind of done was separated out, okay, which of, there are already different implementation guidelines that are out, including from the, the federal government and the Department of Ed. So I think we sort of dissected some of those and said, okay, what concerns come up through implementation, and what do these documents sort of point to as solutions to these issues. So I think if we can get more eyes on that, add more information, and then perhaps speak to some of the specific concerns that have come up through this conversation, and sort of focus in on that. If everybody could, who has the time and capacity in the next, in the next 2 weeks, could contribute to that, as well as because I want it to be from sort of the collective of the council itself. While I'm happy to draft a report, I'm also would be happy to have contributions from those of you and from your individual perspectives and expertise. So I could definitely send something out for review in that same time frame. The issue is, I know we are behind in our own timeline, and I want to ensure that campuses know that they have support from our council and aren't left flailing. So I do want to provide something concrete we can put out to them, but I think at this point in time, it's going to be something that kind of acknowledges that we are awaiting more information. But here is what we know thus far. Here are some things, regardless, we know that they're going to need support through implementation, and just sort of provide them with an update, and where our council is at, and then follow up as new information, comes out. But that is my view based on just kind of seeing all of your concerns that you approached, me with today or previously. And I would love for more input on how we can have a more effective process moving forward, or, just take into consideration any of the concerns that may have been raised today. Hillary?
Yeah, I am wondering if, I think that all sounds really helpful, Bridget. And I'm wondering if it just may be really useful if in the instruments we've already looked at, that we do maybe just, highlight the questions that would pertain most directly to our legislation for the state of Connecticut. And the reason I think that that's still important to do is because, as was said at the outset, I think Kristen said it, was that those may be questions that we still ask to have added because they are a part of our legislation. So what you caught, I mean, just be really clear on which those questions are from each instrument. I think that might be helpful to us, because the VAWA reauthorization goes back up in 2027. It could be a different administration and we could lose this provision. I mean, that's the reality. So I think that as a state, we passed this law being mindful of how committed we are to this. And even though we will probably have to, allow for the federal instrument to be in place, that's not guaranteed to last forever. I mean, so that I guess just that's my concern too, is given that it's embedded in a reauthorization type of legislation, is it possible that that requirement for a federal survey could disappear depending on regime change? And then at the state, we waited for that. I'm not sure on how that would work. So I'd rather we still look at what we're supposed to do by the state. What instruments have we looked at that have those elements that at least at that minimum, we're asking those questions? That was my thought.
Absolutely. No, and I almost feel like we're sort of, because that's something I've thought about too, is, well, what happens if this somehow does change? And we want to ensure institutions are essentially prepared for either direction, right? What would it look like for them to put out something less comprehensive from, under the state legislation that still fulfills those questions that they are required to essentially speak to and assess to some extent? What would it look like if they are putting out something less comprehensive under the state legislation and then putting out something more comprehensive federally? What is this going to look like if, if they're able to actually fulfill the state's requirement through this federal legislation, either depending on when something is rolled out, if it were to be rolled out by next spring, or if we manage to get some sort of extension. So what would that look like? There are kind of different paths here, and I think it will depend on what happens next, both in the state and federally. However, I essentially want to ensure that institutions feel ready for anything, right? So they are prepared to potentially put out something less extensive or more extensive, depending on what the timeline of the federal government here looks like. So I think our report can definitely speak to what these different sort of paths would look like, sort of a choose your own adventure, right? Here's what's going to happen if this happens, but this does not. Here's what's going to happen if this happens and this happens. And I think that perhaps that's sort of what I'm seeking to add to the report, is what our guidance would be in these individual paths, to ensure that they are both keeping to the, the state legislation, as well as, what they're mandated by federally, and then also keeping in mind the fact that essentially that is implementation guidance, right? So it's still sort of under our purview. We're sort of looking at how this is best implemented in conjunction with federal legislation. So that was sort of my thought. So I think that sort of marries nicely with what you're saying, in that I think there are different potential outcomes here, and we do want to be prepared for any outcome. Lilly?
Yeah, I think your plan that you're laying out makes sense to me, and it sounds like the kind of follow-up discussion, Bridget, that is shaping up between you and Representative Elliott and maybe others about potential timeline alterations that might be feasible or might not at the state level would be helpful in narrowing the array of how many different alternative paths that there might be.
Mhm.
So sort of as a precursor to laying that out.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. So I think I also have some additional notes here, just speaking to section 3 and talking about some of the duties of institutions. But I think we will, of course, want to sort of, as Hillary had spoken to, and has, I think that the chart sort of speaks to as well, we will want to highlight which questions we've identified speak to perceptions of campus safety, and see which we'd want to recommend in the case of needing to do, this federal legislation happening sooner rather than later. And then I also wanted to point to an sort of added protection that we had in our legislation, which is that no assessment responses may be used as basis for disciplinary action or legal proceeding, which is a provision that we have in the state that the federal, legislation doesn't provide. So I was definitely glad to see that as something that's included, and something I think we should encourage institutions to remind students as they are conducting even a federal survey. If that is, what we end up essentially, recommending, right? And then institutions are still also going to have to provide the information to the higher ed committee, in a report, according to the state legislation, and the state and federal legislation do require that they publish it to their website. So the sort of public record aspect is part of both, but providing it directly to the the committee is unique to Connecticut. So I did want to kind of speak to that third section, despite the fact that the second is sort of where our tasks are outlined. I did think it was important to kind of look at where it differed in terms of the duties of the institutions and how that would impact us. So in regards to the distribution, since it sounds like as long as everyone is on board, and again, please feel free to interject and speak up if you don't feel as if it's the best path forward. But I think we would be at this point well positioned to put out some sort of implementation guidance in the form of more of a report that prefaces the the content that we'll be providing, talking about this federal legislation, where it intersects, and what different paths may look like moving forward and what institutions should prepare for. I think as well as sort of the process as to how we got here, right? A little bit of summary. And then we can provide, I think there's been a lot of really great work done to provide notes on the tools that are at hand. So all we'd really have to do now at this point is if somebody wants to volunteer with the, for the task to go in and sort of highlight the data points that, first of all, the data points that are in our Connecticut statute, and then sort of to essentially double highlight those that speak to perception of campus safety. Knowing that all 4 of those points may need to be included by 2023 if we're unable to get an extension, and knowing that that additional piece for perception of campus safety is going to need to be collected in addition to whatever is mandated federally. Then we, I think if, again, anyone who has the capacity to contribute could provide further feedback on the implementation guidelines. And that piece that speaks directly to not only just implementation of sort of the preparation piece, but in actually, implementing a more comprehensive survey. What do some of those, what do some of these guideline documents say, and different issues that they speak to? So that's already something that was outlined. Lilly had made a chart for that as well. And there is some information there. But again, given that our primary focus, I think, has sort of been these tools, I would really love if folks wanted to weigh in with more information. So I think those are the kind of three pieces we're looking at: is that preface, the tools and the highlighted data points within them, and then the the summary of the implementation documents that are out there. I'd be seeking input other than the highlighted piece for those tools, for, again, whoever would wish to volunteer, who was perhaps on that original subcommittee, input from, any of you and all of you for that ultimate report that I'll be sending out, and then the implementation guidelines that are already there would be incredibly helpful. But what does a realistic timeline look like, given those are the materials that we want to distribute, again, in recognition that we are behind, and I want to ensure that institutions have something to turn to once kind of word of this gets out. And I think there's already enough concern about having to implement something from the state. I think having something more lengthy and prescriptive, and a real survey tool from the federal government may be cause for concern for some institutions, and I want to ensure they feel supported. So what does a realistic timeline look like based on sort of the work that we'll need to complete? Anybody have any input? Hillary?
I mean, as far as going through, I feel like people have already done a really thorough job on the instruments. So I think that we could, I think 2 weeks just to go, if just on those, you just want us to kind of highlight the questions. I think 2 weeks is feasible for those. It sounds like the other stuff might take a bit more in terms of your conversations with Representative Elliott and that. But I think as far as kind of looking back at those instruments and just us looking at them with fresh eyes for those questions, I personally think 2 weeks is probably feasible. I don't know how other feel about that.
Sure. Yeah, I think, quite honestly, I think while we can review it to make sure, the last I had sort of looked at that document, it does look like it's rather complete. It would just be a matter of highlighting the questions that speak to those specific data points. So I feel confident in that timeline for that, absolutely. So if we were to look out a month from now and say that we had something by May 1st, would that be realistic based on everyone's capacity to pitch in and review? And also within that timeline, I can provide that report because I do need to make substantial amendments just given the discussion of the federal legislation. And of course, I want to connect with Representative Elliott and everything like that too. So I think I can plan to have that to the council within 2 weeks. So you have those final 2 weeks of the month to review and amend that. I want to ensure I'm giving you all ample time to contribute content. I think in the report, I already kind of did speak to the timeline and essentially why it has taken us the time that it did. But I think we essentially in many ways would have been ready to go. I think this would have been, had we not had this sort of interruption, I think with the federal legislation, I think we needed to dot a few I's and cross a few T's and would have been prepared to distribute material, I think in the coming days even. But given this interruption, I definitely will speak to that and in an explanation of our timeline and delay. So I think the other piece I wanted to discuss today as we're talking about distribution and distribution for, the end of April, beginning of May. So this, whatever our council sort of comes up with and presents would be on our council's landing page. So on the state website where, there you have access to the meeting agendas and videos and things of that nature. The information would be available there. It has to be available there. I checked in with Jeannie to make sure that could happen. And she assured me it did indeed need to happen. So that will absolutely be available there. But I know that, if this isn't on institutions' radar so directly. I want to ensure that they still have, we do some outreach to ensure that they're getting these materials. So I wanted to reach out to those of you who are here on behalf of institutions to see, based on your relationship at those institutions and your expertise, who do you think would be the best contact points as a general rule? And then I would definitely want to sort of somehow, task us with putting together sort of a contact list that we could distribute this out to upon its completion and send them to the link that would be available on the state website so that they could, access those tools. But I, again, would be curious to hear what each of you would sort of recommend as a point of contact from an institution. Or multiple points of contact, of course. Hillary.
Definitely Title IX coordinators have been a part of this conversation. So I think Title IX people are going to be important. And at some institutions, those Title IX people are housed under student affairs. Some are kind of in a middle ground, some are under academic affairs. So I actually even think the provost is really important too, or a provost-like position. And that's important, not just in terms of like, are they going to do anything with this information, but we want to start messaging from the top. I mean, we want to have our chief academic officers signaling how important this is for the campus community to embrace this and take this seriously. So I actually think letting the provost or, vice chancellor or someone like that, analogous, but definitely Title IX. I'll let others.
Yeah, absolutely. Kara?
Yeah, sorry, I haven't spoken much. Everyone's just been making excellent points. So just been observing and absorbing. But yes, I agree with that. In addition to any CART or SART team chairs, which at WCSU is the Title IX coordinator, but including CART in that, or SART, whichever universities have as well.
Absolutely. Allie?
Yeah, echoing Kara's point, those who oversee the confidential resource centers that some institutions have, the confidential resource advisors, and then it might be independent of the institution. I'd let other people weigh in on the efficacy of this, but those who oversee the memorandums of understanding that partner with some colleges and universities, that could be a helpful, more outside force.
Okay, yeah.
And I just wanted to add, I think it would be helpful for circulation to all the Title IX coordinators in the state of Connecticut.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that was definitely, yeah, I mean, I have, so essentially I already have a spreadsheet created that I've utilized for different things, given, my role does address any institution in the state of Connecticut and all institutions, at the Alliance, I provide support to in some capacity or another. So I do have an alphabetized list of institutions in the state. And so my plan would just be to add headings with, the offices that we all feel are important, which will be in our folder as well. So if you could just take a few minutes for those of you that are here on behalf of institutions to contribute the names and email addresses of those individuals. So we have a complete contact list. Kristen.
Yeah, I was trying to go through our directory, have ideas. Because Title IX, Dean of Students directly, those are the only other ones I thought of. Because I don't think we have a department that just does general research. I don't know if other schools do, if that would be an idea, but that's all I could think of.
Yeah, and I think as essentially, if there are any, some of these spaces, there may be some gaps, but I think, we know that all institutions are going to have a Title IX office. So I think ensuring every single Title IX office is contacted is going to be, critically important. And then I think that that's something we can definitely commit to. And then some of these other offices, but again, in recognizing there could be vacancies in others, but there's always going to need to be somebody in Title IX, even if it's in an interim capacity. All right. So I guess my last question then would be whether we want to meet one more time at the end of next month to sort of check in, review, touch base, or if we would prefer to keep in touch via email reach out if there's anything you need, and we can continue to connect that way. So I sort of want to see what everybody's time looks like. I don't want to take time if we don't need it, because I know how busy everybody is, but also if it would be helpful for us to connect. I want to provide us with the opportunity to do so and get some dates from Jeannie we might be able to do so. But any input in that respect? Yeah, Lily?
I think meeting at the end of the month makes sense, given the kind of milestone that you've laid out as well about kind of rounding out materials by a May 1st target.
Great. Okay. I'm seeing mostly nods, so I'm presuming that that is popular opinion. I just didn't want to, declare that we were having a meeting if you all didn't feel it was necessary, but I think that that would be the best course of action as well. So I'm happy to see we're in agreement. So that was essentially what I wanted to lay out, but I know we talked about a lot and there's a lot of new information on the table today. So I did want to open up the floor if there are any sort of miscellaneous questions, comments, concerns about how we're moving forward or about anything that was discussed today. All right. So just to clarify, before we make a motion to adjourn, I'll be reaching out to Representative Elliott and discussing what our options may look like. Make those amendments to the report and then put that out to you all in 2 weeks. If somebody could go into the document that speaks to the different tools and highlight the pieces that are necessary data points that we need in collection, as well as sort of provide perhaps a different color of highlight or something of that nature to the question speaking to perception of campus safety. And then if everybody who has the time and capacity could please weigh in on the piece for implementation and sort of the guidelines around implementing a survey. Kristen?
Sorry, I'm having trouble finding the document for the implementation in the drive.
Yeah, no worries. I know there was another, somebody else was unable to find the link. I can definitely, I'm going to be sending up a follow-up email to all of you anyway, so I will include that because I know that was one of the subcommittee documents. Everybody should have access to all the files, but perhaps it's like if you didn't get the link or something, then you might not know exactly how to find it, but you do have access to it. So I will follow up and provide that link at both links. And then if somebody could just let me know that they're covering the highlighted portion so that I know that that's something that's being taken care of. And then I will ultimately send out the report via email, but also it will be available in that same larger council folder for your review. I'll make sure to as well, because I know that, again, while you're all in the folder, somebody didn't have the link and had reached out to me. So I want to make sure you all have that link on hand again. So if you want to, put a little star on that email, because it'll kind of have it'll be kind of a reminder email with all the different resources that you have access to and may need. And you also always can reach out to me. My phone number is listed at the bottom of my email signature, and you can reach out to me via phone or text. Email is always good. I definitely am eager to provide, whatever support that I can within my role and bring whatever concerns you may have to the table with the rest of the council should need be. So with that, that's sort of what we're tasked with ahead. I'll also be reaching out to Jeannie to figure out what our next meeting can be, when our next meeting can be scheduled for. And so I will provide that date. I'll plan to send out the email tomorrow with all the information that we need along with that date, because usually we're able to coordinate that pretty quickly. So again, before we conclude today, are there any other last minute thoughts? No. Well, thank you all so much for such Representative Haynes.
Hi, I just wanted to really quick just say thank you all for all the work you're doing, and looking forward to seeing what comes at the end of it. So I just want to say thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here today and for that. And I'm definitely eager to see what we all come out with. And I'm really thankful for all the hard work and time you've all put into this council. All right. So with that, as long as I don't see any other hands, if somebody would like to make a motion to adjourn.
I move to adjourn.
Anybody second?
I'll second it.
Excellent. All right. Take care of yourselves, everybody, and keep in touch.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.